Anna Bogenholm. Anna was out skiing with her buddies one day in 1999, doing what people in Sweden apparently think is fun, gliding around frozen wastelands. She was a radiologist, so maybe she thought breaking ice and bones was a good way to spend her free time. Anyway, she was zipping down a slope near Narvik, Norway, when she lost control and crashed onto a frozen stream. Smooth move. Then the ice gave way, and Anna slid right into freezing water, headfirst. So there she was, trapped under an 8-inch layer of ice, with just a tiny air pocket keeping her from drowning immediately. Her friends scrambled to help, but breaking thick ice isn't like cracking open a beer can. They called for help while trying to smash through the ice with ski poles, which went about as well as you'd expect. Meanwhile, Anna was hanging out in the water, slowly turning into a human popsicle. She spent 40 minutes conscious down there, which says a lot about her willpower. After that, her body gave up and she blacked out. By the time the rescue team arrived and finally yanked her out, she'd been under the ice for 80 minutes. Not 8, 80. Let that sink in. Her body temperature had dropped to 13.7 degrees Celsius. For reference, your average dead person hovers around room temperature. She wasn't breathing. Her heart wasn't beating. Her pupils didn't react to light. So yeah, by all normal metrics, Anna was deader than disco. But normal apparently didn't apply to her, because this wasn't the end of the story. The helicopter that airlifted her to the nearest hospital had doctors who looked at her and probably thought, well, this is a lost cause, but sure, let's try. They started performing CPR on her lifeless, icy body, which had gone full Elsa by this point. She arrived at the hospital 2 hours after the accident, and the medical team went to work warming her up while continuing chest compressions. They hooked her up to a heart-lung machine, which basically kept her blood circulating while they tried to figure out how not to let her die twice. After about 9 hours of constant work, her heart decided to show up for duty and started beating on its own. Small miracle. But waking up from being clinically dead isn't like waking up from a nap. She spent 10 days in intensive care, during which her kidneys failed, her blood clotted like crazy, and her nervous system probably sent hate mail to her brain for dragging them through this. Doctors didn't even know if she'd wake up with her mental faculties intact or at all. Eventually, she did regain consciousness, but not without some serious side effects. Her body was a wreck. Months of rehabilitation followed, where she had to relearn basic functions like walking and not falling apart emotionally. Imagine surviving death only to find out that life has handed you the world's most brutal recovery process. But Anna wasn't just about to call it quits after beating hypothermia and medical improbability. By 2000, she returned to work as a radiologist, which feels like the ultimate stick-it-to-the-universe moment. Marie Bigot. Marie Bigot's life went completely off the rails when she developed arachnoiditis, a nasty inflammation of the membranes around her brain and spinal cord. If that doesn't sound awful enough, it took away her ability to see and hear. Imagine waking up one day and the world just mutes itself while also turning off the lights. Arachnoiditis is basically your body's way of saying, we are going to shut down. Watch this. So, Marie was left with basically zero sensory input, which might sound peaceful for about 5 minutes until you realize it's more of a living hell. Her doctors didn't exactly have a lot of hope. They tried the usual medical routines, which are about as comforting as being told, well, we can manage your symptoms. If you translate that one, it means, we have no idea what's happening, but good luck. She couldn't see. She couldn't hear. Most people would have just checked out mentally at that point, but Marie? Nah. Her body had other plans. Then, something almost impossible happened. Slowly, like painfully slowly, she started regaining her sight and hearing. No one really knows how. It wasn't like she popped a magical pill or found a miracle cure. Her recovery was more like her body deciding, you know what, maybe I overreacted, and started to patch itself up. The medical world was stumped, probably scrambling for ways to explain what happened without just saying, well, this one's on God or luck or whatever. Her eyesight was the first to come back. Then her hearing followed, which had to feel like a cruel joke after months of total silence. Welcome back to hearing people cough, babies cry, and dogs bark at nothing. Lucky her, she had to deal with endless rehabilitation sessions. These weren't your casual yoga classes either. It was hardcore, frustrating work. Physical therapy, sensory training, all the stuff that makes you wonder if staying broken might actually be less annoying. And let's not forget the mental toll. Losing 2 major senses, then regaining them, doesn't come without some baggage. Her brain had to relearn how to process everything again. Everything feels new and a little off, but Marie somehow pushed through it, even though the whole thing sounded like a nightmare. Stephen Callahan. Stephen set off in his little custom-made sailboat, the Napoleon Solo, in January 1982. Things went swimmingly until his boat took a nosedive 6 days out from the Canary Islands. Well, more like the ocean punched a hole in it. The boat sank faster than Tom Sizemore's career. You don't know who Tom Sizemore was? Well, point proven. Callahan barely had time to grab a survival kit and hop into his life raft, which was basically a glorified pool float. This was just him, the raft. and whatever odds and ends he managed to salvage. Now stuck in the middle of the Atlantic, Callahan had to figure out how to not die. The raft came with a solar still for purifying water, but calling it reliable would be generous. It worked about as well as a dollar store flashlight. For food, he had some rations, but those disappeared quick. Eventually, he resorted to fishing, which involved using a spear gun to catch fish and dodging sharks that showed up for the party. Yes, sharks. Because drifting for weeks with barely any food or water wasn't miserable enough. He also had to deal with sharp-toothed freeloaders circling his inflatable home. The raft leaked constantly, so Callahan had to keep patching it up like some doomed arts and crafts project. His body started breaking down too. Dehydration, sunburn, and salt sores turned him into a walking biology lesson on why humans are terrible at surviving in the ocean. He lost a third of his body weight and spent most days rationing his energy between fishing, water purifying, and not losing his mind. Speaking of his mind, Callahan kept himself going with a mix of determination and whatever scraps of optimism he could muster. He also relied on sheer stubbornness, because apparently, giving up wasn't on the menu. He charted his drift using a homemade sextant and some paper scraps, trying to figure out where he might land. He had no idea where he'd land, but it passed the time. Sharks, dehydration, hunger, and even a leaking raft weren't enough to break him. Well, not completely. He spent his nights staring at the stars, probably wondering how he got stuck in the worst camping trip ever. After 76 days of this floating disaster, Callahan finally spotted land. Or more accurately, some fishermen spotted him. He washed up near the Caribbean island of Marie Galante, looking like a skeleton in a raft. The fisherman took him to safety, and just like that, his nightmare was over. He had survived starvation, dehydration, sharks, and the Atlantic Ocean trying to kill him. Eva Wisniewska. Eva went for a routine paragliding session in February 2007 in Australia. Well, routine is a loose term when you're a world-class athlete in a sport that basically involves dangling from a glorified bedsheet while hoping wind currents don't turn you into a human lawn dart. She was prepping for a competition, floating around the skies with a few other paragliders, when a massive thunderstorm showed up. And by massive, I meant a supercell storm that literally reached into the stratosphere. Before anyone could blink, Eva got sucked into this monster. Her little paraglider was no match for the storm's updrafts, which were strong enough to lift her at speeds of up to 50 feet per second. That's faster than most amusement park rides, only without the safety bars or fun. Within minutes, she was launched to an altitude of over 30,000 feet. For reference, that's the cruising altitude of a commercial jet. But why not skip first class and go straight to a frostbite-inducing death zone? Up there, the air was thin, temperatures dropped to around -50 degrees Fahrenheit, and oxygen was in such short supply, it might as well have been a conspiracy. Her body did what any body would in such a ridiculous situation. It passed out. She was unconscious for over an hour, frozen stiff, and surrounded by lightning that could have turned her into a crispy kite flyer at any moment. Meanwhile, hailstones the size of baseballs pelted her. While she was up there, her paraglider got completely iced over, which you'd think would have sent her plummeting like a rock. But the storm wasn't done playing with her yet. The updrafts kept her floating at death-defying heights. When the storm finally got bored, it spat her out at around 23,000 feet, where she started to regain consciousness. Lucky for her, the paraglider miraculously stayed intact. Even luckier, she managed to avoid cardiac arrest, despite her body being frozen stiff. Talk about surviving on a technicality. As she woke up, she realized her hands were frostbitten, she could barely move, and her GPS system was useless because it thought she was, well, dead. Yet somehow, she managed to steer her paraglider back to safety. By safety, I mean a random paddock in the middle of nowhere, but at least it wasn't 30,000 feet in the air or directly inside a lightning bolt. When rescuers found her hours later, she was still alive. Her frostbite wasn't as bad as it could have been. She didn't have hypothermia, and her brain hadn't turned to mush from oxygen deprivation. Medical experts were baffled because surviving even half of what she went through should have been impossible. But there she was, walking around like she hadn't just spent hours being a human ice cube in a storm that could have killed 100 other people. Paul Templar. It started with a calm day on the Zambezi River in Zimbabwe. Paul Templar, a tour guide, was leading a canoe safari. His job was to show tourists the stunning wildlife without getting anyone eaten. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case one day. As the group glided along, they crossed paths with a territorial bull hippo, which is about as friendly as a brick wall with teeth. This hippo wasn't playing around. It flipped one of the canoes carrying a trainee guide. Templar, being the responsible adult, paddled over to help, but before he could, the hippo surged out of the water. It lunged, dragging him under like a literal ton of angry muscle and tusks. One second he was upright, the next, half his body was clamped in the jaws of what might as well have been a nightmare with legs. Here's the thing about hippos. They don't chew, they crush. And this one got creative. It tossed Templar around like a rag doll, chomped on his torso, and then tried to stuff him headfirst into its throat. In case you're wondering, no, that's not normal hippo behavior. This one was working through some serious anger issues. Templar, somehow still alive, fought back, punching and clawing. At one point, he managed to grab onto something slimy, which turned out to be the hippo's tongue. Gross, yes, but it also saved his life because the hippo spat him out. Templar surfaced, barely able to move and missing enough blood to make a vampire jealous. The hippo wasn't done. It attacked again, dragging him under. This went on multiple times. Every time Templar thought he might survive, the hippo came back to remind him who was in charge. Eventually, the hippo either got bored or full, leaving Templar to float in the water like a busted piñata. By some miracle, or sheer luck, his colleagues pulled him to safety. That's when the real horror show started. He had holes in his torso, a broken arm, and ribs sticking out where they shouldn't. Oh, and his left arm was hanging on by a thread. The rescue crew slapped on some bandages and rushed him to the nearest hospital, which wasn't a quick trip. He lost consciousness on the way, probably because his body was now an all-you-can-eat for infection. At the hospital, doctors did what they could. Multiple surgeries, countless stitches, and a whole lot of guessing kept him alive. His left arm, mangled beyond repair, was amputated. The rest of his injuries required months of recovery. Every time he made it through one procedure, another complication popped up. When Templar finally left the hospital, he wasn't the same guy. Half his body was scarred. He had one arm, and his career as a safari guide was effectively over. But he adapted because what else can you do when life hands you the hippo equivalent of a wrecking ball? He shifted to motivational speaking. To this day, Templar holds the unofficial title of Guy Who Got Eaten by a Hippo and Lived to Tell the Tale. He's also a reminder that hippos aren't the cute, chubby river horses you see on cartoons. They're territorial killing machines that can crush bones like potato chips. So maybe don't paddle too close next time. Janagisi. In 2004, a 15-year-old girl in Wisconsin got nipped on the finger by a bat she tried to save from her church. A sweet gesture, right? Wrong. That bite was carrying a little surprise: rabies. This is where most rabies cases turn into tragic news stories because rabies is practically a death sentence if you're not vaccinated. She didn't think much about the bite at first. Like most people, she washed it, slapped a bandage on, and went about her life. No rabies vaccine, no hospital visit, just vibes. A few weeks later, rabies started doing its work in her body. She started feeling tired, weak, and then came the numbness and twitching. It didn't take long for her to end up in the hospital, where the doctors figured out that it was rabies. Rabies is a nightmare. It messes with your brain, makes you hallucinate, causes muscle spasms, and eventually shuts your body down. It's one of those things where, by the time symptoms show up, you might as well start drafting your will. But her doctors weren't ready to give up. Instead of shrugging and saying, well, she's doomed, they pulled out the Milwaukee Protocol, an experimental treatment that had about as much success on record as convincing a cat to take a bath. The protocol was wild. They put her in a medically induced coma, essentially shutting her brain off so the virus couldn't keep wrecking it. Then, they pumped her full of antiviral drugs, hoping to kill the rabies while her brain chilled out and healed. Sounds simple, but it wasn't. For weeks, her body was kept in this weird limbo state. Machines were doing the heavy lifting while her brain stayed quiet. The doctors monitored her like hawks, adjusting medications and praying they weren't just delaying the inevitable. Rabies isn't known for playing nice, and it's not like anyone had a manual for how to pull this off. Then, something ridiculous happened. She started improving. Slowly, sure, but still. The virus didn't kill her, and her brain started waking up. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, which in medical speak means it could actually work. After weeks of this intense treatment, she survived. No vaccine, no prior immunity. Just sheer medical stubbornness and a bit of luck. Of course, surviving rabies isn't a clean getaway. It left her with some long-term effects, like slight speech issues and balance problems, but considering the alternative was, death, those side effects seemed like a fair trade. Peter de Rutter. In 1875, a Belgian guy had a broken leg. Not just any broken leg, though. This thing had been messed up for 8 years. Peter de Rutter, the guy in question, had a fracture so bad that his bones were doing a permanent "we're never getting back together" dance. No amount of 19th century medical genius could put him back together, which isn't surprising given that most doctors back then thought leeches were the Swiss Army knife of medicine. The whole mess started in 1867 when a tree fell on his leg. Yeah, a tree. Not the most glamorous injury, but it got the job done. His femur was shattered, leaving him hobbling around with what can only be described as the worst best leg accessory ever, a gaping wound that refused to heal. Over time, the bone fragments started doing their own thing, poking around while his skin gave up entirely and let the infection party roll in. For years, Peter was stuck like this. He couldn't work, he couldn't walk. He could barely even stand without feeling like his leg was about to be torn out. The guy wasn't rolling in cash, so decent medical care wasn't an option. Even if it were, there wasn't much decent about medicine in rural Belgium at the time, so he basically sat around waiting for nature, or divine intervention, to sort things out. By 1875, Peter's wife was over it. She wanted him to visit the sanctuary of Our Lady of Lourdes, a place known for its supposed miracle cures. He wasn't thrilled about it, but eventually got talked into the trip. It probably helped that the alternative was spending the rest of his life not being able to stand on his ground. Now, this sanctuary was kind of a big deal. Lourdes had been a hotspot for miracle seekers ever since a girl named Bernadette claimed to see the Virgin Mary there in 1858. People flocked to the site hoping for cures, blessings, or just a chance to say they visited the divine equivalent of a celebrity hangout. Peter wasn't a die-hard believer, but at this point, what did he have to lose? Worst case scenario, he'd have a story to tell, or at least as much of one as a guy with a broken leg could gather. When he finally got to the sanctuary, Peter prayed. Not a shocking behavior for someone who'd run out of options. What happened next is where things go from bad medical drama to Ripley's Believe It or Not. He claimed that the moment he stood up from his prayer, his leg was healed. Fully. Instantly. The bones, which had been partying in opposite directions for nearly a decade, were suddenly back in place, like the world's most aggressive chiropractic adjustment. The wound closed up. The infection disappeared. It was like his leg forgot it was supposed to be broken. Peter went home and showed off his newly functional limb to anyone who'd look. People were understandably skeptical because, well, miracles don't exactly have a high approval rating among rational thinkers. Doctors examined him and confirmed that the leg was, in fact, healed. They couldn't explain how it happened. Honestly, they didn't try very hard. Miracle was an easier diagnosis than admitting they had no clue what was going on. Peter's case was eventually declared an official miracle, which is basically the Vatican's version of a gold star. He lived for another 23 years, walking around on his once destroyed leg like nothing had happened. When he died, his bones were examined again, just to double-check that the whole thing wasn't some elaborate scam. Nope, the leg was still in perfect shape. Wenceslao Mogul. In 1915, during the Mexican Revolution, some poor guy found himself in the crosshairs of a firing squad. Wenceslao was a revolutionary fighter, and let's just say the government wasn't in the mood to hand out participation trophies. Captured during a skirmish, Mogul got a front row seat to his own execution. The punishment? A firing squad, of course. This was 1915. The process was straightforward. Tie him up, line him up, and rain him down with bullets. Mogul got hit with 9 shots. They aimed to make sure he wasn't walking out of there alive, though clearly they overestimated their aim. For good measure, a soldier walked up and put a final shot directly into his head. You know, just to tie things up with a neat little bow. Except Mogul didn't die. Somehow, 9 bullets and a point-blank headshot weren't enough. Either the universe was playing some kind of cruel prank on the soldiers, or Mogul had some kind of unholy durability plot armor. Whatever the case, when the firing squad left, assuming their work was done, Mogul decided he wasn't quite ready to shuffle off this mortal coil. Left for dead, he managed to drag himself away from the scene. Now you'd think 9 bullets and a headshot would leave someone unable to do much dragging, but Mogul clearly didn't get that memo. Bloodied, battered, and probably cursing every god he'd ever heard of, he escaped. The details of his miraculous getaway aren't crystal clear, but one thing's for sure. Mogul lived. He made it to safety and somehow survived his wounds. Medical science, of course, had no comment because the entire thing was simply uncommentable. Uncommentable? Yeah, uncommentable. As for what he did after this absurdly miraculous survival, Mogul didn't retire to a quiet life. He reportedly lived for decades afterward, probably getting endless free drinks for the rest of his life by telling the story of how he survived a firing squad. If nothing else, his experience serves as a pretty solid argument for never assuming you've finished the job. Jordan Taylor. At 9 years old, a kid managed to survive something doctors don't even like putting a name on because it sounds ridiculous. Orthopedic decapitation. This is medical jargon for when your skull basically disconnects from your spine. It's not a scratch and dent kind of injury. Most people don't survive it, and the ones who do aren't skipping out of the hospital. This kid, Jordan Taylor, yeah, he beat the 1% odds like it was a game of chance he had rigged in his favor. The whole disaster started with a car accident, the kind that makes parents swear off road trips forever. Jordan was in the back seat, probably not even thinking about his spine because, well, what 9-year-old does? The crash hit with enough force to pull his skull away from the vertebrae. When paramedics showed up, they probably figured they were on a recovery mission, not a rescue. Jordan wasn't breathing. His heart? Not interested in working anymore. He was technically dead, but these medics weren't clocking out early. They managed to get his heart pumping again. The breathing came back too. The doctors took one look at the CT scans and probably started prepping their "we did everything we could" speeches. Jordan's spinal cord, by some twist of biological engineering, was intact. His skull had disconnected from his spine, but the cord wasn't severed. Think about that for a second. His body said, "We're going to keep the most delicate piece intact, but let's make everything else look like a demolition derby." Surgery wasn't optional. It was a "do this or you're toast" kind of deal. They brought in a specialist doctor, Jitka Vakulova. The procedure involved screws, metal plates, and a whole lot of hoping everything stayed where it was supposed to. The doctors had to reattach the skull to the top of his spine while avoiding any damage to the spinal cord. Post-surgery, the recovery process was its own beast. Jordan was in a halo brace for 3 months. Physical therapy was the next hurdle, and you can bet it wasn't a walk in the park. His muscles needed to relearn how to support his head. Movements that you don't even think about, turning your neck, holding your head upright, became monumental tasks. But Jordan worked through it, because apparently being a statistical anomaly wasn't enough. He had to keep proving people wrong. So here's the thing. Keep safe. We all aren't 1 in a billion like these guys. See y'all.